How did this become a thing in Western culture where all these grown men and little girls are jerking off to little K-pop boys?
What's up, everybody? I'm Finn McKenty. This is the Punk Rock MBA, and if you clicked on this video, then either you know exactly what I mean by the title, or you are asking yourself, wait a minute, what in the hell is this guy talking about? And to give you an example of what I mean, go check out your local Hot Topic. That's right, the store that emo kids practically lived in back in the 2000s, during the peak of emo, because they could get everything they need in one place. Their Paramore and My Chemical Romance shirts, their Invader Zim merch, and of course those like weird stripy fingerless gloves that they always wore. But these days, if you go to a Hot Topic, half the store is merch for K-pop groups like BTS, Blackpink, and Twice. Emo got straight up kicked out of Hot Topic by K-pop. But it's not just Hot Topic, and in case you think I'm reaching, consider that one of the biggest K-pop labels called SM recently launched a new group called Rise, which they officially called emo pop. And so to me, it's pretty clear that a lot of the people who are into K-pop now are the same people who 15 years ago would have been into Fall Out Boy and Panic at the Disco and writing fan fiction on LiveJournal.
I was being bullied a lot in school because of my weight, so BTS helped me kind of get through all the hard times and stuff.
And so the question is, what exactly is happening? How did we get here? How did American Hot Topic kids get into Korean pop music? And why does K-pop strike the same chord with them as emo did with kids back in the 2000s? Those are the questions that I will try to answer in this video. Cold turkey may be great on sandwiches, but there is a better way to break your bad habits. And I'm not talking about birds in the winter, I'm talking about today's sponsor, Fume. And they look at the problem in a different way. Not everything in a bad habit is wrong. So instead of a drastic, uncomfortable change, why not just remove the bad from your habit? Fume is an innovative, award-nominated device that does just that. Instead of electronics, Fume is completely natural. Instead of vapor, Fume uses flavored air. And instead of harmful chemicals, Fume uses all natural flavors. You get it, right? Instead of bad, try Fume. It's a habit you're free to enjoy, and it makes replacing your bad habit easy. Your Fume comes with an adjustable airflow dial and is designed with movable parts and magnets for fidgeting, which is helpful for de-stressing and anxiety while breaking your habit. Join Fume in accelerating humanity's breakup from destructive habits by picking up the Journey Pack today. Head to tryfume.com/punkrockmba or scan the QR code and use the code punkrockmba to get 10% off when you try the Journey Pack today. That's tryfum.com and use code punkrockmba to save an additional 10% off your order today. For most Americans, K-pop only came on their radar in the last 5 or 6 years, but the roots of the genre go back way further than that. The beginning of K-pop as we know it is usually traced back to 1992, specifically a group called Seo Taiji and the Boys, who formed after their previous heavy metal band broke up, and if you listen, you can still hear that it kind of retained some of those metal elements. They were the first major Korean artist to include rapping in a song, and you can see how they were kind of the blueprint for K-pop in general. It's these like good-looking young guys in cool outfits with super tight choreography, and musically like a very polished combination of Western pop and hip-hop. And as far as their influence goes, as one Korean TV show said when they were inducting them into their Hall of Fame, Seo Taiji and the Boys influenced Korean pop culture greatly enough to divide our past 100 years of history into the times before and after their appearance. Wow, that kind of says it all, right? From there, K-pop continued to grow in the 90s and 2000s as part of what was called the Hallyu, or Korean Wave, which sort of refers to just the overall output of Korean pop culture, including TV, movies, and music. And although pretty much all of this was basically unknown in the West, Korea's influence was growing and growing and growing until they quickly became really kind of the dominant force for pop culture in Asia. For example, I remember years ago talking to my mother-in-law about this. She's from Vietnam, and she used to watch a lot of those Hong Kong historical dramas that take place in like medieval China where they fight each other with swords and stuff. But one day she said, I just can't really get into the Hong Kong shows anymore. The Korean ones are just so much better. Korean skincare products also became hugely popular with Asian women. The Korean wave was officially a thing, and it was much bigger than just music. And the first time that I really heard K-pop was in 2010 through one of my Korean coworkers. And my initial reaction was, I want to like this, but this is not great. It just really felt kind of dated, like they were imitating the trends of Western pop, but from 5 years earlier. Like this was 2010, but they felt like they were still stuck in that kind of Britney Spears, Justin Timberlake kind of era. And at that time, basically nobody in the West knew that K-pop existed or was really interested in Korean culture at all. But a few years later, all of that changed with the release of one song, and that is Gangnam Style by Psy in 2012, which was maybe not necessarily the best song in the world, but it was an absolutely massive hit that really put Korean culture on the map in terms of mainstream America.
Oppan Gangnam Style.
On the surface, that mostly just meant that they played Gangnam Style on the radio like 550 times a day, but it had a deeper and larger effect than just that. The thing I started to notice around that time is that Korean stuff had started to become cool with the same kind of people that were into anime. They came up with the term weeaboo for those Westerners who were just a little bit too into Japanese culture, and as Korean stuff started to become cool, they came up with a new term, Koreaboo, which was really surprising for me to see because I'd spent a lot of time in Seoul for work and I absolutely loved Korea, and I also lived in a suburb of Seattle with a lot of Koreans. But the idea of American young people being into Korean culture would have seemed just like completely impossible to me even just a few years before that. Shortly after that, Girls' Generation actually charted on the Billboard Hot 100, and although K-pop was clearly getting some traction sort of on the periphery of the mainstream, for the most part it kind of really failed to break through in the same way that Psy did despite the best efforts of the K-pop industry. For example, when Skrillex did a song with CL and G-Dragon. Personally, I really thought CL had a chance to break through in the mainstream, but it just didn't happen. The real turning point for K-pop in the West came in 2017 with BTS. As one writer for Vox put it, BTS became an uncontested US phenomenon in 2017 with 2 songs hitting the Billboard Hot 100, a huge performance at the American Music Awards, a New Year's Eve performance in Times Square, and a remix of their latest single Mic Drop done by Steve Aoki. If it's possible to ascribe a tipping point to a wave that seems to be endless, BTS might be it. And since then, they've been the biggest thing in K-pop, and honestly, for good reason. I think their music genuinely is really good, and to me feels much more original and less derivative than the previous generation of artists like, say, Girls' Generation and Super Junior. And since 2017, they have become a legitimate mainstream American phenomenon with several #1 albums, collaborations with artists like Coldplay and Snoop Dogg, several platinum singles, and maybe most importantly of all, they also paved the way for other Korean artists to break into the mainstream, most notably of all Blackpink, who, for example, this year headlined Coachella with Bad Bunny and Frank Ocean. And before I go any further, over 50% of you are not subscribed, so if you like this video, please hit that little button. But I'm not really surprised by the mainstream success of BTS or Blackpink because they are, after all, pop artists. And the entire point of pop is mainstream success, right? But what was unexpected and especially interesting to me is how many of these new American BTS fans were, for lack of a better word, emo. Like I said earlier, it seemed like a lot of the initial wave of K-pop fans were former emo kids, for example, my wife and her friends. But it wasn't just them. There was this whole newer wave of fans who were too young to have experienced emo the first time around. But you could kind of tell that if it was 2005, these are the same kind of people that would have been into Panic at the Disco and My Chemical Romance. At first, I thought maybe it was some sort of an isolated trend, but I quickly realized that I wasn't imagining things. Like I said earlier, around 2017, Hot Topic started selling tons and tons of K-pop merch. And if you look, there's tons of other threads on Twitter and Reddit pointing out this K-pop emo connection. And so the question is, why? what exactly is happening here? The most obvious thing that a lot of people might point to is what you could call the boy band factor. And what I mean by that is the original wave of emo's popularity was primarily driven by teenage girls who, let's be real, were at least partly into this stuff because it was full of cute, non-threatening guys with cool hair, right? And to be clear, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I mean, I'm a big fan of Ruby Rose, and you can probably guess why. So I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it, just that it was clearly a big part of the appeal of emo. I think maybe now that some time has passed, people may have forgotten that part of it, but as just one example of what I'm talking about, remember that Pete Wentz had his own special issue of the teen magazine J14, complete with a "How emo are you?" quiz? And obviously that is a big part of the appeal of K-pop as well. A lot of people have also pointed out what they see as similarities between K-pop and emo in terms of defying gender expectations, like how the guys in emo bands wore eyeliner and girl jeans. But in my personal opinion, in the case of K-pop, I think that's really unintentional. For one, mainstream Korean culture is very conservative, a lot of them are pretty religious, and anything that challenges norms of gender or sexuality, I think, would not be well received over there. I think it's really just that the East Asian beauty standard is different. It gets interpreted as more feminine by Westerners, but it's not their intent to present themselves that way. For example, if you look at all the heartthrob guys on the Korean dramas, everybody looks more like BTS than they do Chris Hemsworth. Another common element to the K-pop and emo fandoms is that they're really driven by parasocial relationships, which is a term that basically refers to the way that fans are very heavily invested in the lives and personalities of the artists and feel like they're friends with them and like these people are part of their lives, even though obviously they've never actually met. And you saw this a lot with the emo fandom back in the day. For example, all the fan fiction, which honestly got pretty weird at times.
So like they write stories about the band in different like sexual scenarios or whatever their fantasy is. Usually it's something like dirty and sexual.
And just like with K-pop, every member of the band had sort of their own persona, and the fans would pick one of them as their parasocial boyfriend. Like, oh, I like M Shadows, but you like Sinister Gates. And you see that same sort of thing now with these quizzes like which member of BTS is your soulmate. And obviously as an adult, maybe you sort of roll your eyes at this kind of thing, but I feel like this is pretty normal and harmless stuff for teenagers to do as long as they don't take it too far, which admittedly sometimes the K-pop stans do. But aside from that, to me, it's like, is this really so different from all these adult men who base their entire identity on the local sports team and like go around wearing their favorite quarterback's jersey in their man cave on game day? I mean, it's the same thing, right? But I think it would be shallow to stop at just the boy band aspect. Because what I was kind of surprised to find out is that BTS and the 2000s emo bands actually share more in common lyrically than I ever realized. I mean, if you look at these lyrics, they could have been straight out of a My Chemical Romance or Census Fail song from 2005, right? Or like this song, 0 O'Clock, which to me feels like it's about that feeling you get with depression, where every day feels like this just sort of like oppressive repeat of the last one. And you're just sort of like trudging through life every day, wondering like, what's the point? If this is what life is like, do I even want to be alive? And just like with the emo bands back in the day, one of the most common things that you'll hear BTS fans talk about is how the band helped them get through some kind of really difficult time in their lives. And I didn't really know that much about the members of BTS before I wrote this video, but as I was researching it, it seems like RM, who is like the leader of BTS, is actually a really cool, thoughtful guy that has a sense of self-awareness and humility that you really kind of don't see that often in these like giant global pop stars. In the same way as I would say that people like Gerard Way and Pete Wentz did. And so you add all of that up and it makes perfect sense why K-pop is the new emo, at least in the West, because it's almost exactly the same thing. Just like emo, it's this very polished, catchy music performed by cute guys with good hair. But at the same time, especially in the case of artists like BTS, there's a little bit more depth to it than you might think, especially from that kind of mental health angle. And I think also just by nature of it being Korean rather than Western, even though it is obviously very mainstream, just like Fall Out Boy and My Chemical Romance were, it feels like it's a little bit off the beaten path. And with all of that being said, I do have a few more, I guess, kind of random thoughts about this K-pop emo connection, which I'm going to go over in no particular order. First of all, it's very interesting to me that the first Asian music to really break out in the West is from Korea, despite the fact that the Japanese music industry historically was much bigger and more sophisticated, at least up until the Korean wave happened. But the fact that Korea is the country to really finally establish a beachhead in the West is not an accident. For one, despite the popularity of things like anime and manga and video games, Japan has always been really kind of an isolationist country that historically has not really been interested in exporting their culture to the rest of the world. Most famously, they closed off their entire country to trade with the rest of the world for over 200 years. And although that ban on trade was lifted a long time ago, culturally there's always been a little bit of that sort of stuck around. And so in the case of Japanese music, there's kind of always been this small group of Westerners who are into J-pop and J-rock, but for the most part, aside from a few bands like Deer and Grey, it really never got much traction outside of these like really diehard weeaboos who would put in the effort to seek it out, because the Japanese music industry really had very little interest in marketing it outside of Japan. But Korea was the exact opposite. The Hallyu, or Korean Wave, was literally a government project called the Cultural Industry Bureau, which they created specifically to project Korean influence across the planet. And obviously, their plan worked. Starting in the 90s, they did stuff like sponsoring the translation of Korean TV shows and movies into other Asian languages so they could spread across the region, subsidizing karaoke bars, all kinds of stuff like that. And I gotta say, they did a pretty damn good job of it, because now, 25 or 30 years after they started that project, they've left Japan in the dust. BTS might be the biggest band on the planet, and the influence of Korean culture from music to TV to skincare is real. And so given the sort of centrally planned nature of K-pop, it's especially interesting to me that it's popular with emo kids, because the emo scene and the rock scene in general usually puts a lot of emphasis on the importance of authenticity, and with all due respect, there's really nothing especially authentic about the K-pop industry. Like I said, it has its origins in like a literal government project, and the groups are put together by what's called the idol industry in Asia, which is basically the same thing as when people like Lou Pearlman put together groups like NSYNC and Backstreet Boys back in the 90s and 2000s. And to be fair, it's not like 2000s emo was some sort of super underground thing either, because these bands were all on major labels and they worked with these big producers like Howard Benson and Neil Avron. But even so, it wasn't really as corporatized and kind of assembly line as K-pop is, where, as far as I'm aware anyway, very few of the performers even write their own music. They just hire a bunch of songwriters and producers who come up with the music and hand it to the performers and say, here's your new song. And to be clear, I'm not attacking the validity of K-pop, because that's really the same way that Western pop works as well. My point is just that it's kind of odd that emo, as a culture which generally highly values authenticity, would sort of look the other way when it comes to Korean music. Which brings up another interesting contradiction, which is how much the fans are really attached to and invested in the members of these groups, despite the very well-known fact that the K-pop industry is absolutely brutal. It is a very well-known thing that the artists oftentimes sign to these really exploitative contracts. The labels won't let them date anybody because they're afraid that if the artist isn't single anymore, that it'll turn off the fans. They get just like pushed to the brink of exhaustion with these crazy touring schedules. And even after becoming famous, they oftentimes get paid next to nothing. There's this like sort of famous story of one of these artists who won an award, sort of like the equivalent of a Grammy, and she was so poor that a week afterwards, she sold it for like $300. And like I said, this is a well-known thing. The fans are all very aware of everything that I just said, and probably lots more that I don't even know about. And yet they keep supporting the industry that mistreats these artists that they love so much. I think because the music means so much to them that they just kind of can't let it go. And so I think it's this really interesting twist on parasocial relationships that a lot of the fans feel genuinely conflicted about. Like, I love this artist and their music, but at the same time, I feel like I shouldn't support it because this industry is terrible, so what do I do? And lastly, the way that K-pop sort of slid in and became the new emo, I think says a lot about the state of rock music in America and really the West in general. I've talked about this in a million other videos, so I'm not going to go on about it at length. But basically, it feels like rock stopped being fun, interesting, or relatable about 15 years ago. Anytime a new artist comes along doing something innovative, or starts getting too much attention for standing out from the crowd, instead of celebrating it, the fans in the industry tend to do nothing but shit on them. As an obvious example, look how they treated Skrillex 10 years ago when he started blowing up. Or more recently, how rock fans sort of sneered at Olivia Rodrigo and called her like derivative and a copycat and all this stuff, instead of being excited that a new artist was bringing attention to the genre. Basically, the rock scene destroyed itself by turning into a bunch of snobby asshole gatekeepers and left the door wide open for K-pop to just walk right in and take their lunch money. And so the real question is, what happens next? What is the future of this K-pop emo crossover thing? Will this just be a phase, or will there be 40-year-old K-pop stans in the year 2044? I don't know, but if it happens, I am here for it. All right, my friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. Also, I want to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get access to all my videos and podcasts early. There are members-only channels in my Discord that I'm super active in. I do giveaways, and there's a way to have me review your music. So if any of that sounds cool, hit the link in the description of this video. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.